And so I think sometimes that small first novel might not get reassigned. If it's a case where, as an example, we had, it wasn't because of the book, it wasn't because the book wasn't liked, but for instance, we had a review assigned of Tom Segev's book, 1967, and then there was the reviewer, there was an issue and wasn't able to review the book, so we had to reassign the book. But as a consequence, we'll be a little late on that, later than we would have liked on that review. So sometimes that happens. I think it's all, but I think, the other sort of unspoken part of this, and this panel isn't about this, so we'll stay off of the subject, is that for most book review sections, newspaper book review sections, space is always at a premium anyway, so it's always sort of a kind of triage situation where you're trying to cover what you can, and you know that there are always going to be many worthy books that aren't going to get covered that you'd very much like to cover, but there's just simply no way to do it. Because you're always fighting to balance how many books you can cover with what's the depth of the coverage you're going to give them, and I think that's a really sort of important balance to keep in mind. It's not just merely about the quantity of books, but also about the quality of criticism.
I'm going to open this up to the audience as we move into that last half hour where people can choose to stay or not. I did want to say this, though. I mean, all 5 of our panelists are authors, have been authors, and our critical community in the NBCC split on that question of turning back books. It was actually one of the few exact splits, 34%, 34%. You should always do it, negative or positive, or no, it's okay not to do a negative review. I find it interesting that probably everybody on this panel thinks you can say whatever you want to say, however nasty it might be, about government officials, business officials, politicians, and so on. But there's a kind of desire that we be kindly to authors. And not really always call a spade a spade. I mean, I want to say something for the critical side. I don't understand why it's not okay to look at a book and say this is really terrible, and maybe even in stinging language, when it's okay to criticize almost every other part of society. Now, one thing that does happen to all of us at newspapers, I think, I'll make this my last question before opening it up, is that some of us find ourselves working for institutions that have rules of ethics we don't necessarily share, that don't make sense to us. When I came in, I remember Mike Levitas was the Times book editor. I remember him telling me, no one can ever request a book for review at the Times. It's absolutely prohibited. We decide who reviews a book. And as you see, that was a question on the survey. Can the people who have been in that situation speak to, how do you handle that? You don't really agree with the code of ethics of the New York Times or the LA Times as it applies to book reviewing, but it's there. Yeah, I'd like you.
I want to say, Carlin, let's go back to this business of being kinder to authors than we are to politicians, to businessmen, or whatever. There's a difference in kind and a difference in quality between the people who have power and the people who don't. And some innocent person who's published even a bad book has no power to wound the culture, to wound you, to wound anybody else. But somebody who is in government, somebody who runs a big business, somebody who owns a newspaper, somebody like that has a lot of power in the community, and you have to speak to them. You have to say that they're lying. You have to make sure they don't get away with anything, because these people run the world. The first novelist does not run the world. I think you are obliged at a certain point, if it's a Philip Roth or whatever, somewhere along the line you say, I didn't like this book, I didn't like that book or whatever. But that's a reputation. He's established. He's not vulnerable. He's not out there without a shell on. He's not somebody who spent all those years writing a book and then sending it naked out into the world, having been antisocial all that time, and this is his child, and you stomp on it. So what? Big you. These people do not deserve the rudeness of a culture that has tended to rudeness anyway.
I just want to jump in on this one point. At the risk of sounding like the hard ass on the panel, I hope I didn't give the impression that I think we should be nice to writers of books that don't merit niceness. And I think that it's important, again, it comes back to the importance of negative reviews, not because it's important to be negative, but because it's important to tell the truth about what you think about a book. I think that's true from a writer's point of view. I think that's true from an editorial point of view. What I draw the line at is I don't think it's ethical to write or publish a hit piece. But I do think it's ethical to write and publish negative reviews, even negative reviews of writers early in their career, if that's the review that you get. And I do think it's essential in terms of the readers, again, trusting the publication, that we assign books to reviewers who will say what they think and who will wear their enthusiasms or their anti-enthusiasms on their sleeve and won't pull their punches. I mean, this is something that I say all the time to people: don't pull your punches. And but I also think sometimes reviewers tend to pull their punches in terms of positive criticism as well. They feel that it's somehow anti-intellectual to be effusive or to be emotional. And I think that book reviewing, again, in terms of what Francine was saying, in terms of the shapely essay notion of book reviewing, it relies on the engagement and enthusiasm, pro or con, of the critic. That's what I'm looking for more than I'm looking for a positive or a negative review.
Gosh, is there anything to add? Well, first of all, sure, we publish some very, very tough reviews, and we do it when we think they're good. That is to say that the argument seems to stand up to scrutiny, and the writing is good. It doesn't mean we agree with them, but we publish them, and reviewers, of course, should not feel constrained in what they say or how they say it. Also, as far as books being turned back and going out to other reviewers, we reassign whenever we can. You know, something that I think some of us are obliquely getting at, maybe 2 points. One is there's very different ways in which one can review. I speak as much as a reviewer as a book review editor. Fiction versus nonfiction. Because nonfiction, you can kind of write about the subject and engage with it that way. This is one reason that and this is sort of the corollary point, that the authors who most often get slighted in the sense of not being reviewed because we think we're sparing them are first novelists or authors of their first short story collections. And if you know how the section I edit works, we have by book reviewing standards, by the standards of contemporary journalism, a fairly large staff of 6 or 8 people, sometimes 1 or 2 more, who are actually reading fairly deeply into the galley before deciding whether to assign it. And they tend to be pretty tough. Our reviewers tend to be tougher. And we think, here is a first novelist. Here's a novel that seems like there's some promise here, but what happens when it gets hammered? And this is what John is talking about. You have really nobody from nowhere who's worked very hard and written a book whose only claim to very small celebrity will be that someone eviscerated it in the pages of the New York Times book review. We would rather not do that. Now, to the credit of our readers, and I don't know what experience other people have had here. I've had it both as an author and as a book review editor. Readers often read criticism very differently from the way we inside the business do. For one thing, they tend to think almost any book review is favorable simply because the book is being reviewed and the author's name is endlessly repeated. I remember when a book of mine came out, and it was well reviewed, but there were some dissenting voices, and I was shocked to hear myself complimented on those favorable reviews. And I thought, well, maybe readers know something we don't, which is not only that it's not essential to be parsing every phrase in a review, because the fact is most of us are sort of grub streeters still. That is to say, we're not writing Dr. Johnson or Coleridge's prose, though we'd like to. But also that readers know a review is one person's opinion, and the bylines we talk about and that we covet at my section. I'm sure David does too. We got X to review Y. Most readers don't even notice. Unless it's a huge name, they really don't notice. They notice that the Times Book Review reviewed something. And in fact, publishers